Welcome to the Huddle Up Podcast, your go-to show for all things Broncos.
What is good, Broncos country? Welcome in to the Huddle Up Podcast presented by Mile High Huddle. It's time to drop some knowledge. I'm your host, Chad Jensen, Scout Media, CBS Sports Digital. With me is Will Keys, editor and writer at Mile High Huddle. We both hope you guys had a great Memorial Day weekend. Will, did you do anything fun over the holiday?
Ate a lot of food, watched a lot of baseball. Very patriotic. So I had a good Memorial Day weekend. What about you?
Not a bad way to pass the weekend, watching baseball and eating food. For me, it was just kind of my favorite type of 3-day weekend, which is a staycation. Not expected to go out and do anything too strenuous. Just kind of chill and recharge the batteries.
Exactly. I agree. Absolutely.
Now, today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/huddleup. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And this is a service or a product, Audible, that I use on the regular. I'm a big fan of when I'm not listening to podcasts or sometimes music. I love listening to audiobooks, especially on my commutes and driving around town and whatnot. Check it out. Again, almost 200,000 different titles for you to choose from and a 30-day free trial. www.audibletrial.com/huddleup. Now, we are here, Huddle Up that is, to give you a deep dive on your favorite team, the Denver Broncos, and we need your help. Right now, as a show, we're not a daily podcast, but we do check in with you a couple times per week, whether it's Will and I, Nick and Carl, Luke sometimes, Eric Trickle, and our goal is to give you a consistent kind of audio source for your Broncos analysis. So take a second and rate the show on iTunes. If you're on Android, rate the show on Stitcher. And if you have time, take a second and leave a comment. Two very important things that can help us tremendously. Make sure you're following the show on Twitter at @HuddleUp_MHH. And if you appreciate what we're doing, then retweet the episodes and share them on Facebook. Now, I'm sure most of you are already subscribing to the show on iTunes and Stitcher for Android, but if you're not, just take care of that. Show can also be found on Spreaker, SoundCloud, iHeart, CastBox, and now YouTube. We're pretty much everywhere you need us to be in order to access the show, no matter which operating system you're using. All right, well, let's get to the Broncos talk here. As the team reconvened on Tuesday for the final 7 practices of this Phase 3 of OTAs, we received some not-so-great news. Outside linebacker Shaquil Barrett is going to miss some time. He injured his hip during last week's on-field activities, and he was unable to practice on Tuesday. Could miss significant time, reportedly. Now, following Tuesday's practice, head coach Vance Joseph said that the Broncos don't yet know the severity of Barrett's injury, but they hope to have a prognosis within a week's time. Shaq's going to undergo some further testing and all that. But, well, you never want to hear about guys getting banged up or injured in OTAs, especially when it's non-contact.
Yeah, those non-contact injuries tend to be pretty, I guess you would say, lingering into the season. Sometimes you get ACLs and MCLs when you're not even hitting each other just because it's like I planted on the wrong foot and now I got to wait 6 months to be back. But it doesn't look like it's going to be too severe for Shaq Barrett. It wasn't a chronic issue. It was just something that kind of just happened randomly last week during the first OTA session. So we'll wait back for the prognosis from the doctor. That's where he was today instead of the sideline. So the problem here is the Broncos love sending their pass rushers in waves. And Demarcus Ware, of course, retired a few months ago. And the second wave used to be Shane Ray and Shaq Barrett after Miller and Ware. So Ware's gone. Ray moves up with Von Miller, where he kind of was last year because
Ware was so banged up most of the season.
Yeah, he had a pretty prolonged absence during the middle of the season. He took over. Ray did a really good job filling in. But now, so you hope Barrett's back by training camp at the worst. We really have no idea. It could be a Matt Paradis type of hip injury. Hopefully not. Hopefully it's something pretty minor. Yeah. But once we get that figured out, we got to figure out who is actually going to take the Shane Ray role opposite Barrett in that second wave, because that's a pretty crucial part of the Broncos defense is getting after the quarterback with someone who has fresh legs that's not Miller or Shane Ray.
And someone who can still get the job done. And if you look at what the Broncos currently have on roster, the personnel, we have, of course, kind of a fan favorite from last summer in training camp in Demaryius Thomas, spent his rookie year on the practice squad, and the team's really hoping for a quantum leap from him, I know. But they also signed the veteran Kasim Edebali earlier this year, who's going to compete for a roster spot, also can play a little special teams. And then the team, of course, signed a couple of undrafted rookies who are going to compete. Deion Hollins from UCLA, and then, of course, Ken Eckenem from Virginia Tech, who our draft guru guy, Eric Trickle, really likes Ken Eckenem. So for me, of course, you don't want to see a guy banged up. Just reading between the lines, and we don't know anything absolute, but Vance Joseph didn't sound too alarmed by it in his remarks on Tuesday. But at the very least, this gives guys at the bottom of the roster additional reps and additional opportunities to ply their wares and show the coaches what they can do.
Yeah, and I think people are counting on Dora to make the leap, so to speak, in year two. Usually with your undrafted free agents, you kind of just stash them away on the practice squad after their first offseason with the team. And then year two, like it was the case with Barrett, they really start to get involved more in the game plan.
Yep.
You hope that they can actually make the 53-man roster by then, or else it's either another year on the practice squad or they don't make it through waivers or they're just out on the street. But that's definitely the hope with Dora. And now that, like I said, with Ware gone, they've got a need for that fourth rush linebacker, and whether that's Edebali or one of the undrafted guys that you mentioned or Dora, that'll be one of the narratives that we're looking for throughout the rest of OTAs and then into training camp in the preseason.
Yeah, to me, and before we move on, I mean, really, as long as hopefully it's not severe, and if it's not severe and it's even something he can come back from, in a week or so, just stash him, let him heal up, and wait till training camp or at least mini camp to trot him back out on the field.
Yeah, that's the plan. It's still May, so
that's right.
It's the right time to get injured. If there ever was a right time, I guess it would be now.
Yeah, and the silver lining for Shaq is, even though it is a new coaching staff at the head level and a lot of new faces, especially on the offensive side, it's still Joe Woods, and he's really built up, Shaq that is, equity. Over the last couple of years, he's proven himself. I don't think his roster spot is in any danger. I mean, you look back even, for example, last year, a lot of people forget Benny Fowler, who had made both Benny and Shaq were undrafted in 2014, practice squad guys that year. 2015, they both make the roster finally out of training camp. And then last year, Fowler fractured his elbow, I believe it was, in the first preseason game. Didn't see any more reps or snaps in preseason action, and they still kept him. He made the final 53, and even though it wasn't his best season, I think Shaq has even more equity built up, so I'm not so concerned about him having a roster spot necessarily in any kind of danger.
Yeah, all you have to know about what they think about Shaq Barrett is go back to 2015, and right at the trade deadline, they were talking about a Joe Thomas trade with the Cleveland Browns, and Shaq Barrett was one of the names mentioned. I'm sure it was Shaq and then probably a first-round pick. But John Elway didn't want to part with Shaq Barrett, and that's when they had Von Miller, DeMarcus Ware, and Shane Ray all on the team.
Yep.
And if that doesn't tell you what they think about Shaq Barrett, I don't know what does, because they had Ryan Harris starting at left tackle at the time. They really needed one. And, of course, they won the Super Bowl without Joe Thomas, but that's not a guy you want to pass up too often.
Absolutely. Now, another absence notable on Tuesday, Demaryius Thomas was unable to attend. According to Vance Joseph, there was a personal issue DT had to attend to, and he is expected back this week. But again, this is another scenario, Will, where the guys at the top of the depth chart, they're not available, gives the other guys more reps, and that can only mean good things for the rookies, Carlos Henderson and Isaiah McKenzie. Yeah,
you hope it's nothing too serious with DT. Obviously, we've heard plenty about his personal life in the past few years, especially with the whole narrative about his mom leaving prison and coming to see a few of the postseason games in 2015.
Yep.
But like you said, it does benefit the guys who are kind of on the outside and get those first team reps. So probably the guys who benefit most, Jordan Taylor is DT's backup, and then the two rookies, Carlos Henderson and Isaiah McKenzie. He was drafted primarily, I think, to be a returner, but his junior year at Georgia last year, he really took off as a receiver and a returner. He had over 600 yards and 7 touchdowns for the Bulldogs last year. So I wouldn't count him out as that potential slot guy, yep. But he probably contributes most on special teams, and then hopefully gets a few targets.
He's been making some hay while the sun is shining. I've heard a lot of good things about McKenzie in these early days of OTAs. But that's a good point about Jordan Taylor. In fact, I did a breakdown on him, I think it was about a week ago on the series at milehighhuddle.com, Broncos on the Brink, where we're looking at guys who aren't necessarily bubble, guys on the roster bubble, but guys who are kind of in make-or-break type scenarios. Are they going to make it, or are they going to fade into obscurity? And I took a long look at Jordan Taylor, and I really do feel like he's a guy who is on the upward trajectory. And as DT's backup, again, good point. He could use all the reps he can get and really shine for this new offensive coaching staff who are new to Jordan Taylor and exactly what he can do on the football field. But, he's a guy that really shines in practice. I mean, he's the camp star the last 2 years, and so I don't think that's going to be a problem for him. It's going to be proving himself under the preseason lights.
Yeah, we remember that catch he made in training camp last year. Saw about 50,000 vines of that when that came out. And do check out that Broncos on the Brink piece. Lots of GIFs, which people love in the scout articles.
Oh yeah,
lots of good film GIFs.
Oh, yeah. We take it, it's all about diving deep for our listeners and diving deep for our readers and premium members. And check that out, too. A lot of these more in-depth analytical stories at milehighhuddle.com are for premium members. Cost $5 a month. You get access to 100% of our content, but you also, the benefits include 10% discount on tickets through Ticket Monster, and 10% off on merchandise through Fanatics. Now, another thing here, Will, everybody knows by now that Broncos cornerback Chris Harris Jr., this guy's a first-team All-Pro last year. He was voted the 63rd best player on NFL Network's Top 100 Players of 2017. Now, we know this show is a sham, and that it's basically the network's best effort at creating filler-type content during the dead time on the NFL calendar. But I wanted to talk about this today because of Harris himself and what he had to say about the issue following practice. And as media, really, it was our first opportunity to hear directly from Harris in a long while. Here's what he had to say really quick about being ranked 63rd on the top 100 players of 2017.
Man, it's just motivation. It just adds more more fuel to the fire. I might be the only first-team All-Pro that didn't make it in the top 50 probably. But it just I need something like that. I guess just getting all these accolades and awards and things. I guess it's good to have one thing to where it just keeps me motivated. And it's a joke though.
Now, Will, Harris answered this question in good fun and with good humor, obviously. He's laughing, but his placement on the top 100, it clearly irritates him. And he talks about, of course, his individual accolades that he's received of late, especially being an All-Pro and a Pro Bowler. But I look at this type of thing for Chris Harris and for Broncos fans. Isn't being ranked 63rd on the top 100 kind of a quintessential first-world football problem? Again, first-team All-Pro, Pro Bowler the last 3 years. Why does it matter where he's ranked on some arbitrary list? I mean, the voting system is questionable at best. As he pointed out in that same interview, we didn't play the clip, but he went on to talk about, Will, that the players are given a card and they're asked to pick their top 10 players in the league, and somehow that ends up shaking out to a top 100. Were I a betting man, in other words, I'd wager good coin that many of the names on the top 100 are plucked out of thin air by the producers of the show, never to have been mentioned by a single player on their top 10.
Yeah, it's a very bizarre voting process because you see guys at the end of the list like Alex Smith, and you think, well, who actually put Alex Smith in their top 10? Maybe some 49ers who used to hang out with him and
Eric
some of
Fisher.
his teammates. Yeah, maybe Eric Fisher and some of the Chiefs. But regarding Chris Harris, and I think he has a good point about being a little bit upset about it, and I think that's good for him because he's a guy that uses that edge, and he has since he's been an undrafted guy out of Kansas.
Yeah.
So there's a stat coming from Pro Football Focus that Chris Harris Jr. has actually allowed the fewest yards per coverage snap over the last 5 years from 2012 to 2016. That's ahead of guys like Richard Sherman, Pac-Man Jones, Darrelle Revis, and then Josh Norman. Josh Norman, of course, was a few spots ahead of him in the 50s, next to Janoris Jenkins, who wasn't even on the list. And then Harris was 0.79 yards per coverage snap, which was 0.05 yards lower than the second lowest cornerback in that statistic.
Wow.
That kind of tells you all you really need to know, because what else does a cornerback do except shut down the receiver on a consistent basis? And that's kind of what Chris Harris does. He doesn't really pick off a ton of passes, and he never has. And he's never going to be that guy that intercepts, 6 to 10 passes like Champ Bailey was at the height of his career.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a result of quarterbacks being smart and watching film and realizing I'm probably better off throwing it to Bradley Roby or one of the linebackers or TJ Ward or even Aqib Talib from time to time, because he can give up the occasional big play than Chris Harris.
Definitely.
And so I think that's where it really comes from, is you don't see him on SportsCenter and you don't see him on NFL Network with these pick sixes and ridiculous highlight interceptions consistently. He'll come up with one if he gets the opportunity, but I think that has something to do with it. Yeah, so Harris doesn't play in a big market like you'd see with Janoris Jenkins on the New York Giants, and then Josh Norman in Washington, Darrelle Revis for most of his career with the New York Jets. And then he doesn't cause a stir like Richard Sherman in Seattle, and then Pac-Man Jones, who is also on the Pro Football Focus list for the fewest yards allowed. And I think that has a lot to contribute to it. He's not a quiet guy necessarily. He likes to talk, but he's more of a local media guy as opposed to a national media guy when it comes to big quotes or big sound bites.
Right.
So I think that has a big part in being in the consciousness of most football players when they're filling out a list.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's really just a list and absolutely nothing. And it is just NFL Network filler programming during the summer months.
It really is.
And so if it gives Harris an edge, cool. But I don't think anybody really cares.
Yeah, no big deal. Nothing to see here. And again, the biggest takeaway from it is obviously it irks him a little bit. But hey, undrafted guys are constantly looking for that mojo. Even a guy like Harris, who has basically accomplished all that you can in the NFL, Super Bowl ring, All-Pros, Pro Bowls. He got paid. So hats off to Harris. The last thing he needs to worry about and cares about, frankly, is a top 100 arbitrary list. But we're going to kick off a new segment on the show called Do You Buy It?, where we're going to tackle a common Denver Broncos narrative each week. And we're going to determine the merit of that narrative. And today we're going to start out with a particular issue. Take it away, Will.
So one of the big narratives coming out of the first OTA sessions last week was that Demaryius Thomas is feeling a little bit more comfortable in Mike McCoy's offense, where he started to have his first breakout season in 2012 and then carried it all the way through the Adam Gotsis offense into the 2014 season. Mike McCoy's back in Denver. The Gary Kubiak offense left with Gary Kubiak.
Yep.
Do you buy that Demaryius Thomas is going to have a renaissance in production with Mike McCoy back calling plays?
I don't necessarily buy it. And I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm selling, but I think there's still a lot to be determined. It's not so easy as just saying Mike McCoy's back, the boys are back, and Demaryius Thomas and the Broncos offense is just going to fall right back in to the groove that they were in when he left at the end of 2012. And the reason why is because the Denver Broncos, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the quarterback situation here in a few minutes, but until the Broncos have clarity at the quarterback position, it makes it a little bit harder to project exactly how the receivers are going to do. And, of course, that includes Demaryius Thomas. Now, I do think you're going to see him have a better stat line, maybe in yards and touchdowns, than he did last year, where he caught over 90 balls, but he only had 5 touchdown receptions. The Broncos have really been focusing on red zone offense under Mike McCoy in these early days of OTAs, and I think that's going to end up paying some dividends. I mean, you can't get much worse in the red zone than the Broncos did in 2016. So I think that's going to work out better for guys like DT, Emmanuel Sanders. Is Demaryius Thomas going to return to the same mold he was in 2012 and even 2013 and 14 when it was Adam Gotsis operating his offense on the bones of Mike McCoy's system? I'm not quite ready to go that far, only because, again, we don't know for sure exactly how the quarterback situation is going to shake out.
I guess I do buy it more or less, and that's mostly because of the McCoy system and less to do, I guess, with the quarterback situation, because that's still pretty much up in the air, and we can't say definitively one way or another until we know who's starting. But the Mike McCoy offense, what it does is it gets the ball into the hands of the wide receivers more frequently than the Kubiak one does. The Kubiak offense likes to build up to a big play, where the McCoy offense is all about, quick bubble screens to DT, a slant, a lot of out routes. And that's where he does thrive. He likes getting the ball in space. He likes getting those out routes that Peyton Manning was so good at throwing it to him.
Yep.
And we have to see also, will the touchdowns come back if the Broncos get better in the red zone? That's kind of where they come from. And he only had 5 last year, and I think he only had 5 or 6 the year before. But a lot of that was because the quarterbacks didn't do very well in the red zone. Peyton Manning his last year struggled, and then Trevor Siemian and to some extent Paxton Lynch in the 2 or 3 games that he played. It was hard to punch the ball in into the end zone inside the 20-yard line. And I think with a little more experience, either of those guys will probably improve in that situation and realize that, Demaryius Thomas is the best option when you get inside the 20-yard line just because of his height. And I think Peyton Manning was so good at taking advantage of that. And once either one of those guys realizes what they have in Thomas at, I think he's 6'3", 200, anywhere from 220 to 230 pounds. He really is the best.
Wherever they decide to list him.
Right. So once they figure that out and it kind of clicks that, I should just throw the ball high and let Demaryius Thomas grab it, like with that one-handed catch he had in 2012 against the Chiefs.
Oh, yeah.
That was kind of the peak Manning to Thomas hookup. But I think he'll have a couple more touchdowns as a result of that. And I think he might surpass, 90 catches is a lot, especially when you have Emmanuel Sanders eating a lot of targets on the other side. But I think with a few more added bubble screens and then quick outs and whatnot, he'll creep up to about 100 catches again and probably about 1,200 to 1,300 yards, depending on how well the quarterbacks play. And so I guess that is buying it.
Yeah.
And a return to what he was putting up during the Peyton Manning era.
I mean, this is a guy who has now 5 consecutive seasons of catching at least 90 balls. So
that's a ton.
He's as consistent as they come in the NFL, to be honest with you. And again, it just comes back to quarterback consistency, and whichever guy they end up going with or whoever wins the competition, just having the ability and the confidence to spread that ball around to the right guys, to the playmakers. And I'm confident, at the very least, that Mike McCoy is going to coach these guys up. I'm just pumping the brakes on Crown and DT on another leg, going back to 2013. But I do know the Broncos, the new coaching staff, Mike McCoy, Bill Musgrave, these guys are really focusing on red zone offense and being efficient inside the 20. So hopefully that'll end up paying dividends for the Broncos once the regular season kicks off. Now, we've heard some noise from Vance Joseph and Bill Collar that Adam Gotsis, the second-year defensive end, has made some huge strides heading into year 2. The boots-on-the-ground guys like Andrew Mason, who works for DenverBroncos.com, the digital side of it, he even tweeted that, quote, Gotsis burst through the line and batted down a Siemian pass at the line of scrimmage. Gotsis, much more active at making plays during OTAs, close quote. We've heard a lot of similar type things, and even from Gotsis' teammates. And today, Tuesday, even head coach Vance Joseph complimented Gotsis. Here's what he had to say real quick.
Physically, he is definitely a new player. I mean, he's 300 pounds. He's probably 13% body fat, which is amazing. He is explosive and athletic. So now he has to get reps and play more. But he's a second-round pick for a reason. That's what I saw on tape, in college. This guy, who we're seeing now. So I'm excited about him. He's finally healthy, and you can tell.
Now, Will, a full season removed from that ACL injury, and everyone's got to remember, last year was Gotsis' rookie year. He was coming off an ACL injury in which he suffered in October, on Halloween of his last year at Georgia Tech. So with a full season removed from an ACL injury, Will, do you buy Adam Gotsis ending up being the starter opposite of Derek Wolfe and actually living up to his draft position, providing the Broncos with a little bit of return on that draft investment?
Yeah, so this is probably the one where I would tend to pump the brakes a little bit more, just because you hear this a ton, and it's kind of a trope during the offseason where player X is in the best shape of his life, or player X is finally, living up to being drafted in the first or second round.
Yep.
And you can't really buy into it until you see in training camp when the pads are on and people are hitting and there's full contact, especially for a defensive lineman like Gotsis. I think maybe if it was a quarterback or a wide receiver, I'd be more willing to buy into it. But with such a physical position like 3-4 defensive end, you do have to pump the brakes and you do have to wait. Well, is this just a product of having a good physique in June and hitting
doing a good job lifting in the off season?
Right. So we have to wait, and we have to see, is he performing against guys like Garrett Bowles or Menelik Watson or Ronald Leary on the inside? Can he hold up against the bigger offensive linemen? And that's what you hope with an additional year removes from an ACL injury. And I think he is probably, right now it's Jared Crick, but right now he's probably the top candidate to take over opposite Wolfe. And that's what you want. Drafting a guy in round 2, you would hope that by year 2, he has to be a starter. That's what you bank on in the second day of the draft.
I'm not buying. I'm selling this because basically the thing with Adam Gotsis is I'm going to believe it when I see it. That's really what it comes down to. And it's not that I don't think he has it in him. I do think he has great potential. But if you go back, and granted, we can talk about him still not being fully recovered from his ACL injury and all that. But if you go back and watch the tape last year, when he was on the field consistently, and I'll add, Nick Kendall, Mile High Huddle, did a great film piece breaking down some of Gotsis' tape from last year. And as he elucidates in that same piece, Gotsis got blown off the ball so consistently. It was almost like he wasn't even there, didn't know where to go. And that's in a system. And I just read Wade Phillips' new book called Son of Bone. And in it, he talks about, as complicated as some of the concepts in the 3-4 defense, his version of the 3-4 defense might be, he always simplified it so it was easy for players to learn the system so that they're out on the field reacting and playing rather than thinking. And notwithstanding that same approach, the simplified single gap, just go out and attack type of approach that the Broncos had on defense last year, Gotsis still just didn't really seem to know where to go. He didn't fully, it's just on the surface. I mean, we don't know exactly what these calls are on a play-in, play-out basis, but just watching from the outside, looking in, he didn't know where to go. He was blowing off the ball consistently. And yes, coming out of the season, obviously you listen to the Broncos, you listen to Bill Collar, he chalked a lot of that up to just not quite being there physically yet, whether it's through his ACL or whether it's through just not quite yet having honed that NFL body. But with a full off season in the tank, the first time as a pro, because rookies get to basically, after they get drafted, they have like a quarter of an off season to really prepare themselves physically and get into the grind. And so this year, I understand why the hype's coming in. Because if you look at him, he just looks like a different player. And obviously on the practice field, he's really impressing people, including his own teammates and coaches. But with Adam Gotsis, I'm still at a point where I'm going to believe it when I see it. And when the rubber meets the road in training camp and on preseason, that's when we're going to find out for sure what the Broncos really have in Adam Gotsis in his second year. If I were to bet on it today, I would say that, right now Jared Crick, because of his starting position last year, is the starter opposite of Derek Wolfe. Come training camp, I think that's going to be Zach Kerr, and it's going to end up coming down to probably Kerr or Gotsis. I think Crick is best used in sub packages to rush the passer on obvious passing downs and third down. So I see Zach Kerr as probably being the starter on first and second down at that other position opposite of Derek Wolfe. But I'll tell you what, I hope Adam Gotsis comes out and proves me wrong.
Right, and we have to remember Adam Gotsis is Australian, so when he was ready, he had to adjust to things being right side up. So I think another year will help with that development.
Absolutely, yep. And he hasn't been playing American football for very long. So, and that kind of ties into, again, why I'm still kind of selling on that, is he still has a little bit of ways to go, but there's a good chance he can get there this year, and he's got one of the best position coaches in the NFL in Bill Collar and a great system and supporting cast. So we hope that he can turn the corner, and if it's not this year, Broncos fans, don't panic. There's still plenty of time for a guy like him to develop. Now we have another new segment to break down, and we're calling it Quarterback Watch. That's right. The Broncos QB competition is going to dominate the storylines leading all the way up to the regular season in all probability. So each week, we're going to filter through all the latest in the Broncos QB competition, break it down for you, our listeners. Will, kick us off.
Right. So I was cruising Twitter this morning, looking for updates on OTAs, and one of the interesting subplots that I came across was a Twitter user named @TylerWhite tweeted our friend Brandon Perna a video from Will Park's Snapchat that he took of himself watching a couple plays film on his iPad or his Microsoft tablet, I guess,
right,
from last week's OTA sessions. Both of the plays showed Paxton Lynch in the shotgun formation missing a couple throws to open wide receivers. It's obviously a pretty small sample. It's just a couple of plays. But what does it say about Lynch's development heading into his sophomore season, and what does it say about his lingering issues with accuracy?
Honestly, I don't think it really means that much. I mean, pretty much everything I've heard from the people who are there every day, the people I'm talking to, they're impressed with him overall. The coaches have been impressed with him. The number one derogatory thing that I've heard, and really the only negative thing I've heard about Paxton Lynch so far through OTAs, is just him struggling with his staying on schedule, A, and B, his accuracy on short and intermediate routes. Everything else Paxton Lynch has done so far has exceeded expectations. He's got a surprising command of the playbook already. He is, as Mike McCoy talked about last week, he's standing tall in the pocket. He's showing poise. He can make every throw, the deep outs, the comebacks. He's not afraid to challenge the defense vertically. But in the NFL, it's all about consistency. And in order for Paxton Lynch to separate himself and for the coaches to feel confident in starting him, he's got to be consistent. He's got to stay on schedule, and they've got to be able to trust his accuracy underneath. Right,
and it has been a problem since he's come out of Memphis, and even his senior year when he played really well. That still wasn't one of his strengths, was timing and those quick little screen passes. He's struggled, and it hasn't gotten a ton better. And a lot of it has to do with footwork and then, being on top of the different concepts on offense and then figuring out the timing as well, which it just comes with development. It's not going to be there for every quarterback. Not everybody's going to be Russell Wilson or Andrew Luck their rookie year.
Yep.
And certainly that wasn't Paxton Lynch. But it does take time, and you want it to be there by year 3. And like I said, it's just a couple of throws, and it doesn't tell the whole story. So I think we have to reserve judgment a little bit. I don't want to fire too hot of a take about Paxton Lynch is a bust.
Right.
After seeing 2 plays from OTAs. It's certainly not promising, and it kind of confirms what we've been worrying about since he has been in Denver. But it does go to show that he still needs a little bit of time, and he's not quite there yet, and he hasn't mastered the things that Trevor Siemian has. And I think Cecil Lammey tweeted something about the difference between the 2 quarterbacks that sums it up pretty well. He says that Siemian throws it on time, and he anticipates the passes before they happen, and Lynch has to wait a little bit longer and can't quite anticipate it as well, but when he throws it, it gets there faster.
Right.
And it's kind of a, Jay Cutler versus Jake Plummer situation where do you want the guy who throws the fireball maybe a half a second late, or do you want a guy who throws it on time a second early, anticipating the throw? If both throws get there at the same time, which is better? And typically the more consistent option would be the Jake Plummer or Trevor Siemian type.
Yeah, again, in the NFL, it's all about consistency.
Right, and we don't know who the Broncos are going to ultimately dub the starter before the regular season, and it's not even worth conjecturing after a couple of weeks of OTAs. But and then there's the other side of this, which is Will Parks. You might want to not Snapchat the plays.
I think he's getting a little conversation, I'm sure, from Patrick Smythe, head of PR there. Will Parks is dealing with proprietary information on those tablets, the plays the Broncos are running. I mean, not even the media are allowed to see a lot of that stuff on field. They're dismissed for good portions of it each and every day. And, I mean, if you're Will Parks, you're a 6th-round pick from a year ago. You had a solid rookie campaign. You did impress some people early on in your career, but going into your second year, your position on the team is not exactly bulletproof. I mean, the Broncos didn't draft any safeties this year, but they did sign 2 or 3 of them in the undrafted ranks, and you still have TJ Ward, whom they're talking to about a possible extension, Darian Stewart, and then, of course, Justin Simmons. So, if you are Will Parks, dude, you got to be a lot smarter than that.
Yeah, I think it actually might have violated something from the collective bargaining agreement going back to 2011. So he might actually get a fine. I think the three possibilities are fine, suspension, and termination.
Ooh. And
I don't think they're going to cut Will Parks for this or suspend him. Because it's not really that big of a deal, but he might get a fine.
But that's fine he deserves a fine. Honestly, I mean, it's just not smart. Come on, dude, you got to be better than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as bad as like DJ Williams in year 10. I think he might have tweeted the actual playbook as well, which we get it. If you want to brag about studying the playbook, just say that you're studying the playbook. We believe you. Just
prove it out on the grass, man. I mean, just prove it out on the grass. But no, I think getting back to the point, though, is I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. And again, we're going to be checking in on Quarterback Watch on a weekly basis, and it'll be interesting to see if Paxton Lynch is going to be able to progress in this way of staying on schedule, showing better anticipation in the short and intermediate routes. So it'll be fun to see how it shakes out. But we really can't read too much into it. But to close out the show, let's take a quick question, Will, from the Mile High Mailbag. Reminder to the listeners, tweet us your questions. Each week we will address them on the show when we can. Today's question comes from David Cromelo at DCrom59. Will, his question for us is, does it feel like this is a, quote, going to get worse before it gets better situation the Broncos are in? Now, thanks for the question, David, and I'm not 100% sure what you're talking about specifically. So, Will, let's maybe approach this from kind of the 10,000-foot perspective. Now, the Broncos are coming off a 9-7 season. Of course, they didn't make the playoffs for the first time in John Elway's era in the front office. Got a new head coach, Wade Phillips, arguably the most influential person on the Broncos' fortunes over the last couple of years, gone. We have yet another quarterback controversy, another quarterback competition that is yet to offer any clarity. It's a revamped offensive line, and meanwhile, the Oakland Raiders, the Kansas City Chiefs, they have had a resurgence, and the AFC West is suddenly ultra-competitive once again. Now, I've set the table, Will, so let's start with you. Does this feel like it's going to get worse for the Broncos before it gets any better?
Barring a really difficult schedule, I don't think so. The NFL is not like the NBA where if you're not one of the top teams, you have to blow it up and rebuild and start over like the 76ers for the last, what feels like 25 years. So the Broncos addressed their holes on offense, which was obviously the offensive line. They added some firepower with the 2 wide receivers in the draft and then Jamal Charles, which was really priority 2 on offense.
Yeah.
And then we're waiting for one of the quarterbacks to emerge, really. And that's, I think, the biggest variable in the Broncos' success this year is if they get good, consistent quarterback play. I think they're as good as anybody in the AFC West. And if they struggle like they did at times last year, then I think they are around anywhere from 7-9 to 9-7 for another year. Does that mean they've gotten a lot worse? Not necessarily, because so many games come down to a couple plays here and there. And if you're 8-8 one year and you were 9-7 the year before, you can't necessarily say, well, they're markedly worse than they were last year based on one game.
Right.
And, X, Y, and Z doesn't go exactly the same. And a bounce of the ball decides so much in this league. So I don't think it has to get worse necessarily. John Elway is all about winning from now on, and he's never been one to concede a rebuild, and he hasn't had to. And I think some teams really have to, especially like teams like the New Orleans Saints, and then they'll have Drew Brees retire, and they'll actually be facing a true rebuild.
Yeah.
And that hasn't been the John Elway era in Denver. They haven't needed to. And when you thought they did, that would have been 2010 when they went 4-12. You thought, well, this will take a couple years.
Right.
And then they're in the playoffs next year. And then the year after, they're 13-3 and one of the contenders in the AFC.
The number one seed.
Exactly. And they're the number one seed 3 out of 4 years following the Tim Tebow season. So things can change so quickly in the NFL that I don't think you ever have to say, well, we're going to have to concede this year and
right.
We'll get them in 2 years.
It really does, I think, come down to the quarterback situation. And to answer your question just very directly, no, I don't think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But for the Broncos to really get off the ground and improve over what they established in 2016, they need clarity at quarterback. This isn't a full rebuild. It was a company line, the things we heard from Vance Joseph from the time he was hired all the way up until they went through the draft. It's a reboot, not a rebuild. And that's, it's catchy, but it's also true. I mean, John Elway has done a very good job in terms of keeping the roster stocked, keeping very balanced. I mean, he's got all-pro and Pro Bowl caliber players on both sides of the ball. And the defense has largely remained intact. And the biggest issues and holes that the Broncos did have on defense in terms of stopping the run, they beefed up big time in free agency with Domata Peko and, of course, Zach Kerr. So when I look at this, the Broncos defense is going to be, in my opinion, better than they were last year, at least in stopping the run. Do I expect them to be the number one passing defense for the third year in a row? I mean, they have the same talent on the roster, but even that, I think, would be maybe expecting a little too much. But nevertheless, I still think this is a top 5 defense. And so long as you have a top 5 defense in the NFL with stars at the skill positions on offense like Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, even C.J. Anderson, if Jamal Charles ends up panning out, I mean, that could end up being a very explosive offense if the quarterback situation is clarified. And even Trevor Siemian, if let's say he wins the job, I mean, it's not like he blew the doors down in 2016. So there's still, whoever wins the job, it's not just finding out in terms of, when I say clarity, it's not just finding out who the guy's going to be. It's whichever guy that does end up being, turning the corner and providing the Broncos with consistency at the position. And if they can do that, you're going to see them get to double-digit wins because the defense is just so good. But if they're still struggling and we're dealing with quarterbacks still developing and learning the ropes, and I mean the Broncos defense is going to keep them in games, but I just have a hard time seeing them, being able to contend. Could they contend for a wild card? Yeah, but I don't see them being a powerhouse in the conference this year, no matter who ends up winning the starting job. So we'll see how it shakes out. But honestly, Will, I think at this point the Broncos are in a pretty good position. They just need one of these young quarterbacks to turn the corner. Well, hey, that's all the time we have for today. Again, be sure to follow the show on Twitter at @HuddleUp_MHH. You can find Will in the Twitterverse at WillKeys6 and myself at Chad and Jensen and, of course, at Mile High Huddle. Again, tweet us your questions. We'll address your concerns on the show as often as we can. And don't forget to subscribe, y'all. For Will, I'm Chad. We'll talk to you soon.
Mile High Huddle.